Great. Thank you so much, Kirsty, for introducing me. I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of two things I love very much, the International Institute of Tourism Studies and Travel Massive. I've been a chapter leader in DC for about 5 years now, and it's been an amazing community for me, both personally and professionally. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to partner with Travel Massive on this webinar series and a topic that's very important to us here on over-tourism, or are we loving our destinations to death? We have a really great speaker lined up for you, Jonathan Tourtellot, who's on the line as well. I'm just going to share a little bit more about the Institute and the Sustainable Tourism Destination Management Program before we get started. So the GW International Institute of Tourism Studies is a leader in tourism education, research, and technical assistance. We've done projects all over the world with various consultants like myself, as well as with thought leaders like Jonathan, and different destinations like Jamaica, basically helping push the conversation forward in sustainable tourism. We've also put together a lot of capacity building, research, and different professional development, which we'll talk to you about on the next slide. One of the flagship programs that the International Institute has put together is the Sustainable Tourism Destination Management Certificate Program, which is an online program designed to prepare tourism practitioners as well as aspiring tourism practitioners to sustainably lead tourism and destination management. It helps with planning, marketing, stakeholder engagement, so many of the aspects of tourism that you would think about and things that you would not think about, just like over-tourism. Basically, I mean, over-tourism is really, not managing the destination fully, and Jonathan will talk about that a lot more, and how do you manage the destination to mitigate over-tourism. So we've asked Jonathan Tourtellot to speak with us today. He's an expert on this topic, as well as many others, as you'll probably learn. He is a former National Geographic head editor, as well as the CEO of the Destination Stewardship Center. He's written extensively on the topic of over-tourism, as well as destination stewardship, which he will explain a little bit more in his presentation. So I will turn it over to you, Jonathan, and to speak more about the topic of over-tourism.
All right, thank you very much, Talia. I'm not sure if you're all seeing a strange red line through these slides, which I have on my computer here, and if you are, just attribute it to a stroke from heaven of some sort. But otherwise, I hope the show is looking fairly good. Loving our destinations to death reminds me of the time a few years ago when I Googled the phrase "love to death." And the search came back with some 20 or 22 destinations, including quite a few national parks and Princess Diana. So we share our problems with royalty, I guess you could say. But this is really, over-tourism is a new term for an old phenomenon. This has been brewing for really 2 or 3 decades now. And when you see this list of destinations on the left, these are some of the best known over-touristed places and have been for quite some time. But something about this word being coined 2 or 3 years ago, I believe by Skiff, has helped crystallize thinking around what has been really a gathering storm for quite some time. And what's significant is that now we're finding over-tourism cropping up in places you would not normally expect it. Remote places, natural places, and so on. Even Mount Everest. And this is the beginnings of the evidence that this has become a global phenomenon that we must pay attention to. In December last year, the World Travel and Tourism Council came out with a report on this, conducted by McKinsey and Company. They called it Coping with Success. Some people might argue it's more coping with failure, depending on your point of view. But I reviewed the report, and I think McKinsey did a pretty good job as far as it goes. And we'll talk about some of that issue of just how far it goes and how much farther it needs to go. But I do recommend this report. I believe you can download it from WTTC, and it makes for very interesting reading. Over-tourism simply means too many tourists. But what exactly does that mean? according to whom? And with the residents, it's please get out of the way. You're ruining our location. With tourists, it's too crowded. It's too touristy. We're not having fun anymore. And for the caretakers of the destinations and the tourist sites where people go, it's a management problem of wear and tear in addition to crowd control. So if we take a look at this in a little more detail, Barcelona has, of course, become renowned as one of the centers of protest. So is Venice on just too many tourists. And what provokes this? Too much traffic, of course, too many crowds in inconvenient places. But on top of that, inflated real estate is becoming an issue in many cities, particularly the popular and historic city centers. And this is provoked somewhat by home sharing sites such as Airbnb. And to an extent, this is can be thought of really as misuse of the sharing economy platforms, when one individual may begin buying and renting out one apartment, one flat after another, after a house, after another house, and so on, which was not really the original idea of the Airbnb concept. And the consequence then is to begin driving up real estate values, forcing local people out, and changing the tone of the place. This is being now addressed in a variety of cities around the world, sometimes with some pretty creative responses, but it is something where the government needs to take a role. And the other impact of over-tourism is changing the retail flavor of the place. Instead of the shops where we residents used to go, now it's full of t-shirt shops and souvenir things that are not for us, those of us who live here. And eventually the tourists too begin to perceive this. You can tell when you're in a tourist trap because everything is geared towards selling you something instead of the normal goods and services that you would see in any location. And locals in general often don't realize whether or not they're getting anything out of tourism. Somebody coined this phrase, which I love, that for most people, tourism means an out-of-state license plate and my parking space. And this means that there is an opportunity really to help locals get more out of the tourism phenomenon when it is done properly. For tourists, of course, it's just a bad travel experience. We've all seen that happen and had that happen. Crowded, poor value for money, no sense of authenticity. You know you're being given a tourist show. And most significantly, when that happens, not that many stories to take home because you've been too much in the famous tourist bubble and not enough interaction with the actual place that you're visiting. I might add that a lot of tourism, particularly mass tourism these days, is geared toward basically selfie sticks, the opportunity to photograph yourself in front of whatever it is. And this motive for tourism is, I think, becoming increasingly questionable as we run into more and more difficulties with tourist crowds. And then the last issue of too many tourists, of course, is wear and tear. Angkor and many other archaeological sites, particularly if they're not carefully managed, suffer from this kind of abuse. And it doesn't look that bad. So a few people are climbing the monument. But if you think every day, day after day after day, hundreds of people are climbing the monument, it literally wears it down. And I remember when my mother was an archaeological scholar, took us to see the palace at Knossos in Crete. And she touched a eroded limestone wall from almost 4,000 years ago, and showed us where the stone had worn away some more. And she said, this is from people touching this over the years, over the centuries. It does make a difference. We see the same thing, of course, in natural areas where literally footprints can pound down sensitive ecosystems and growth. And even in exploring caves, if you have a tourist cave, the very fact that a lot of people are exhaling carbon dioxide changes the chemistry on the ceilings of some of the caves and changes the way they behave. We do affect the places we visit. So how many is too many? And that is a key question, of course, all over the place. It's often referred to as carrying capacity. Some academics dislike that term because it can be misinterpreted and prefer limits of acceptable change, which is a way to kind of measure more specifically what it is that you are trying to manage. And what is acceptable? This is a matter somewhat of opinion, but also of actual physical wear and tear again, just as we saw there with the Angkor situation. If the destination or the visitor site or attraction is actually being damaged by too many tourists, you've got a problem. A more subtle one is the question of social carrying capacity. For residents, the question is, how many tourists can we stand to have around here before our quality of life begins to deteriorate, even if we are getting some benefit from it? And for tourists, of course, the question is, how many other tourists here are going to be interfering with my enjoyment of this place? I think in some cases, nobody hates tourists more than another tourist. Oh, look at this, there's too many tourists here. Some exceptions for that, of course. But this too becomes an issue. And I know of one professor who photographed Arches National Park in Utah and then overlaid more and more and more tourists into the picture and used this basically to get a measure of what's carrying capacity. At what point do you think this many people is too many to enjoy this location? An interesting technique, and one that's even easier to carry out now with our internet tools. So I refer to the growth of tourism numbers simply as the numbers problem. And what's causing it? Three basic things. There's more people in the world. Back when international travel really began to take off, and I mean literally take off with the first transatlantic jets and whatnot, that's late 50s, 1960 or thereabouts, there are fewer than 3 billion people in the world. Now there's 7 billion. And then on top of that, a lot of them have more money than they used to, which is very nice news. We actually have enough money, many of us now, to travel and enjoy the world and learn about it. And that is a good thing. But it does, of course, increase the number of travelers. And then on top of that, we have a variety of important technological advances, one of which, of course, is those jet aircraft. The birth of the internet has made it enormously easier to travel and find places than it used to be. The growth of the cruise industry is important because as these ships get bigger and bigger and disgorge their passengers into cities, particularly smaller cities, the impact can be enormous. The cruise class known as, let's see, I'm blocking the name of it, Orion, I think. These are ships that carry 8,000 people, of which 3,000 or 4,000 are staff, but they're really floating cities. And when they arrive in a small port, of course, they have an impact. And then we have the sharing economy, as we already mentioned, which has in many ways been a good thing because it's helped distribute tourism dollars through the economy. So it's not just going entirely to hotels, but it too has an impact. But it has made travel easier. Now, I like to use the Mona Lisa kind of as my avatar for the numbers problem in tourism, partly because it's a very important tourism attraction and it's not very big. It's about 19 inches wide, 53 centimeters. And at National Geographic Traveler, where I worked for many years, we did a calculation once. If you were to ask, wouldn't it be nice if everybody could see the Mona Lisa for 1 minute? What would happen if everybody did? And we did the arithmetic for, say, 4 billion people, enough people to understand what they were looking at. And if you were to parade them past the painting in groups of 25, which would be about as big as you could be and still have a good look at the painting, it would take 304 years for 4 billion people to go through the line 24/7, hour after hour, day after day. These are numbers that we now have to begin to reckon with. So if we take a look at the growth of tourism since those first jet aircraft began flying, back in the late 1950s, there were maybe 25 million international arrivals all over the world. Arrivals being someone crossing an international border to take a look around. And some of those people would, of course, been going to Paris and looking at the Mona Lisa. And then By 1970, we're up to 166 million. 436 million by 1990. And by 2012, we've crossed the 1 billion mark in international arrivals. And these numbers are not including domestic travel within countries, which you have to multiply 4 or 5 times the number of international arrivals to get the number of domestic trips totally. And remember the Mount Everest situation. If you imagine that just one person in a million wants to climb Mount Everest in that year, 1 out of a million out of a billion travelers puts 1,000 people on that mountain in any given year. Now, that's not necessarily what's really there, but it gives you an idea of how the numbers work. And about that same time, the UN World Tourism Organization did this forecast. It was in 2011. They were just approaching the 1 billion mark and knew it. And they miscalculated, because by last year, we were already up to 1.3 billion in only a few years, and it's rising even faster than UNWTO thought it would be, to where we're now at 1.3 billion. And when we did the numbers on this, and I started thinking about it a couple of years ago, I thought, wait a minute, there's got to be something wrong, because if we were to say back in 1959, there were 5 people looking at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre on a Tuesday morning, that would mean there'd be 200 people looking at it today. That can't be. Yes, it can. That is exactly what has begun to happen. And you are seeing here basically tourism 21st century style. And I can't think of a better example of over-tourism than this picture. Phenomenal. And just to press home the point, in 2013, David Scousel, who was CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council then, made this forecast, which would lead us to some 3 billion people by 2050 or thereabouts. I've got a image here on my screen. I'm not sure where that came from, but all right, thank you. Now, that was the Mona Lisa in the most famous museum in one of the most famous cities in the world. Let's look at someplace else entirely. And a few years ago, the Philippine Islands began this ad campaign, "It's more fun in the Philippines," and had this slogan, "For privacy in paradise." And what you're looking at there is one of the karst lagoons at El Nido, which is at the north end of the long, skinny island of Palawan in the Philippines. And El Nido is not easy to get to. It's a 4-hour bumpy drive from Puerto Princesa when you fly in. So you gotta wanna be there to take a look at it. And here's a chart of tourism growth in El Nido, 1994 to 2012, which was when I visited there. And you can see how it started growing rapidly in those last few years. And it's ended up making a lie out of the ad, because this picture now looks like this, and that was in 2012. I discovered on researching for this webinar that things didn't stop. Here's what's happened in El Nido since then, going up to as much as 126, and by one count, almost 200,000 visitors last year. And that is more than the place can handle. And just a few days ago came this announcement. Tourism will now be regulated. There will be limits on the number of people that can go to the lagoons, because they don't want Palawan to become another Boracay, another Filipino island that suffers from over-tourism. There's nothing unusual about this story. We're seeing it happen in places over and over and over around the world. So if there's one message I hope you get from this session, it is that there are numbers that are growing. The growth is implacable, and we must deal with it. So how do we deal with it? And here's where some of the measures mentioned in the McKinsey report come to bear. There are various techniques, quite a few techniques, for dealing with over-tourism in specific destinations and places. We'll take a look at a few of them. Not all, because there's too many. Here's a creative example from Charleston, South Carolina, which is a historic city in the southeast of America. Very attractive local neighborhoods. And Charleston had a problem, and the tour buses were disrupting life in the neighborhoods. Too many tourists for the residents, and justifiably so. So they banned tour buses and declared that all tours would now be by horse-drawn carriage, which actually fits the ambiance of the place and adds to the experience a bit. So they replaced tour buses with carriages only. And then to make sure they're not overloading anywhere, they designed 5 routes through the city. And every hour, whichever carriage you're in, it's chosen by lottery as to where you're going to go. You don't know when you get on that carriage what part of the city you're going to see. And it actually works pretty well. And it keeps the tourism from getting out of control in what's really a very small and low-profile city that could easily be over-touristed. Here's an example from Europe. The Alhambra in Spain is one of the best-known World Heritage Sites anywhere. It's extremely popular. It's always had a challenge with overcrowding, and in this place, they have met the challenge with a variety of techniques to space out visitors, particularly time-ticketed admission. When you buy a ticket, it says your turn to explore the Alhambra will be at 2 p.m. And until then, you do something else. And where you do it is in the city of Granada, which happens to be very touristable itself. And the Alhambra and Granada have worked out a good system for managing what is really pretty heavy tourism flow through that area. It gets consistently good reviews. What we found, and particularly in natural areas, from what recreation ecologists have discovered, is that when tourism traffic is low, it's best to spread it out. That way you spare the environment. But as soon as the numbers begin to pick up, then you get a problem. And it happens sooner rather than later. And when that happens, it's then essential to begin to channel people into spaces that are designed to be trafficked. And one case where this became evident was in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, where people were making their own hiking paths up the mountains. These are above tree line, so you could see them scarring the mountain face and causing erosion. And eventually the hiking groups of that area got together and said, we've got to stake out the proper trail and encourage everyone to use that trail and no other. And when you do that, it works fairly well. This is, I think, a metaphor for destination management in general as to how to deal with tourism. And dispersion, which is a favorite and good technique, spread tourists out, can work fairly well. And we're actually right back in Palawan here in the Philippines, but this is not El Nido. These kids are performing a dance, a historic dance, which had been disappearing. And now tourism has helped bringing it back, and they're having a great time doing it. But they're doing it in a town that's some distance from El Nido, and which is setting itself up as a kind of cultural center for tourists. So this is a win-win. It's getting some of the tourists away from the over-trafficked place and helping revive historic customs and spreading some economic benefit around what is still a pretty poor area. So it's a nice little success story there so far. Now let's talk about raising the price. This seems like the obvious solution. If too many people are coming, we'll just raise the price until the number falls to an appropriate measure. And you can call this the Bhutan solution, because just to visit Bhutan, you've got to be spending US dollars 200 to 250 a day just to be there, on top of your hotel, your tour operator, your restaurants, and so on. And it certainly has kept things under control in Bhutan. I haven't been there myself, but one of our workers at Destination Stewardship Center just came back from there, and she gave it a rave. She thought it was wonderful, and I'm sure it is. I can't wait to go once I can scrape up $200 a day. But there is a price for this this kind of solution, and I might add Botswana is doing this to an extent, so is Rwanda in Africa, and it does keep the numbers down. But we have a caution here, and that is simply if culture and history and nature become the private property of the rich all over the world, then only the rich will care about protecting them. And that's not good for conservation or preservation. It's certainly not good for public education. and it's not good for the experience and delight of travel. So I think raising the price can be used to an extent in certain ways in certain places, but we need to have other mechanisms as well, and there are plenty of them, such as lotteries, such as first come, first serve, such as restricted admissions, and so on and so forth. There are inventive ways to get people in to see a place without overwhelming it. And in all this discussion of over-tourism, it's important to remember that a lot of places actually need more tourists, and they do good there. Here in the Peruvian Amazon, the schoolgirl is holding a sign that says, "Welcome tourist friends." And that's because the eco-tour operator there makes a point as part of their business model to bring school supplies to the elementary schools along the rivers in the Amazon basin, and not only help educate the local kids, but also help educate them about their own ecosystem and how it works. So that's a nice win, and there's no over-tourism problem there just yet. Now, let's look at the long-term challenge. These are mitigation measures that we've been looking at, and we're going to need more of them, and we're going to need to get better at them. But there's an underlying problem, which the McKinsey report did not really get into that much. And that is there's a prevailing attitude by governments almost all around the world. Sorry, we have a little siren in the background here. That more tourism is better tourism. And in many cases, that extends to the industry too, at least until recently. And this is pervasive. And last August, I went online and spent only 30 minutes looking for stated policy tourism goals that had been published in the past week. And in just 1 week, here's what we came up with. Jamaica on record to get 4.2 million. Bali wants 6 million. That was before Mount Agung started blowing up. Peru hopes to double tourism arrival to 7 million. Vietnam wants 13 to 15 million, growing 50%. Sharjah in the UAE wants 10 million visitors a year. You know how big Sharjah is? It's not that big. Maldives succeeded in 1 million, on course to 1.5 million. And you could do this search on probably any week of the year and come up with similar proclamations from countries and destinations and towns all over the world. These are people that are not thinking in terms of the numbers problem. And this is the dilemma for sustainable tourism and good destination management. And it's the issue of quantity versus quality. And since a lot of this is driven by economic arguments, it's good to take a look at economic arguments. And if we take an extreme case, if you lived in this town or city, would you prefer to have a revenue stream generated by 10,000 tourists spending $10 a day? Those might be passengers coming off a cruise ship. They buy a t-shirt made in Nicaragua, and you're not in Nicaragua, and then they go back to the ship and have lunch. Or you could get the same revenue stream from 100 high-end tourists spending $1,000 a day on some very fancy hotel, which in turn hires services and whatnot, we hope locally, in order to generate that revenue. Now that's an extreme case. Let's look at a real case. This was a study done in Belize some time ago by CRESS, the Center for Responsible Travel, and they looked at the comparison between cruise ship arrivals in Belize at 800,000 versus stayover people staying in Belize, many of them in eco-lodges. And they discovered that even though the stayovers were 1/3 of the number of cruise ship day trippers, they were spending 5 times as much and contributing 5 times as much to the economy. That's a 15 times advantage for an overnight visitor. And then a couple of years ago, they did the same study again in Grenada in the Caribbean and found something similar, only here the difference was even more stark. 24 multiple advantage to a stayover visitor. And one thing that's important, if we go back to Belize for a moment, a lot of those stayover visitors are eco-lodge tourists. They're in Belize to enjoy the jungle, the nature, the Maya sites that you have there. And with the influx of cruise ship visitors, whenever they go to one of those sites or to any of the local attractions, what used to be a pleasant experience is now overcrowded with cruise ship passengers, with the result then that the eco-lodge operators are not very happy because over-tourism was beginning to cut into the attractiveness of their destination. Same situation when cruise ship day trippers get out of hand in a location that simply cannot handle that many people. Now, there's also a stewardship issue with quantity versus quality. And let's take a look at the Cliffs of Moher in Ireland. This is a major tourist attraction on the west coast of Ireland. And the cliffs are very cliffy. They're very tall, and you can see that they're pretty impressive. And people come and visit and like to walk along the top of the cliffs. Now, the director of the Burren and Cliffs of Moher Geopark wanted to begin raising fees on tour buses, on coach buses that were staying there, because it was ramping up the number of visitors coming in off these buses. And she was, among other things, concerned that it was going to ruin the reputation of the Cliffs of Moher, that was going to become seen basically as a tourist trap. So they proposed raising the fees for tour bus visits to hold down the traffic. But the government of County Clare wanted more tourism, right in line with all those other places we just saw from my Google search. It is a mentality that's pervasive. And the story here is repeated in places all over the world over and over and over, where the stewards of the location and the government policy are often at odds. And that's how you can end up with situations like Florence, where here the last remaining descendant of the Medici family, Prince Ottaviano de' Medici, has started a movement to save Florence from overcrowding. And at the time I was working with him, Florence was getting 16 million visitors a year. It's a city of about 300,000. And 1 million of those were coming from cruise ships. Florence isn't on the sea. They were being bussed in from Livorno and other ports just for a few hours visit, but ending up clogging the streets. So, in order to deal long-term with this inevitable climbing in numbers, I do believe we need to get one of those famous paradigm changes going, meaning we need to rethink how we do tourism, how we travel, and do this at a fundamental level and across the board. We cannot fit infinitely growing numbers of tourists into finite spaces. And we're beginning to see now how that happens. If that picture of the Mona Lisa had 200 people in it, it's not going to be able to handle 400. Now, there's another issue at work here, and that is that tourism as a service industry sells a product that it does not own and it does not manufacture, unless you're talking about a theme park like Disney World or whatnot. Basically, the place is the ultimate product of the tourism industry. The services help us enjoy our travel. So yes, the hotel, the tour operator, and so on, but we wouldn't be using those facilities if it weren't for the place that we wanted to see. And because the place is not recognized by planners as the ultimate product, all too often we need to look at new ways to go about doing this. And I call this the perception gap. And I've become impressed just in the past 2 or 3 years with how pervasive this is. And I'm abusing the Cliffs of Moher here to make the point. But if we look at the left side of this, when people in government and industry refer to the tourism industry, they're thinking of where the money is. And they tend to think that the industry stops where the money stops. And planning is done accordingly. Whereas the place itself, which is not directly involved in the money, nobody paid to build the cliffs of Moher. So it's considered an externality in economic jargon. That doesn't get into the computation. And meanwhile, the stewards of the place who are working to take care of it are not plugged in sufficiently to making economic arguments for something that there is no charge for. And yet, between these two dynamics, the only way we can achieve good stewardship of destinations is to unite these 2 points of view and bring home the case that managing tourism means managing the place. It's the same job. And we have to collaborate in order to do that. So a way to think about tourism is not that more tourism is better. More is not necessarily better. Better is better. And better means how are we managing it? Who is benefiting from it? What are travelers getting out of it? What are local people getting out of it? And is it helping make the world a better place? And that's tourism at its best. So changing attitudes is a huge job, and it's not an easy one, but this is what we're going to be looking at. First, getting policymakers to acknowledge that the product is the place, and the industry role is to facilitate visitation to that place and begin thinking that way. No tourism planning that does not take into account stewardship of the place is complete. And then we need to think about travelers' behavior. True travel experiences, which are increasingly in demand, that's the good news, over hit and run selfie stick tourism, the kind where people rush in, they're there for a couple of hours, they take pictures of themselves in front of whatever it is, and then go home again. These are people counting coup, and they're not really there for a travel experience. And I think we need to start thinking in terms of gently beginning to suggest that perhaps this isn't the best way to go about travel and that they are not getting the most out of travel just by taking selfies. So preferring quality over quantity is important both for the traveler point of view and for the destination planning point of view, and to begin to look at handling tourism in that way. And this means we need to look for practical ways to do this. This isn't easy, because we have not been set up to think that way. This is the way holistic tourism should really work. If people are coming to see what's special about a place, then the community should benefit from it. What's special about a place? By that, I mean its natural assets, its plants and animals. I mean its history, its cuisine, its culture, its architecture, everything that makes one place different from another. And then the community needs to benefit and know it's benefiting. And then in turn, as the community is the ultimate stewards of that place, now they have a motive to protect what people are coming to see, which in turn will provide further incentive for more people to come and see it. This is the way it ought to work. It looks simple, but it isn't. If anything goes wrong with any one of these arrows, then the whole idea begins to get into trouble. If the community is not benefiting, and this happens all too often, this is called leakage. It means the money coming in is leaking right out again and going, say, to a corporate headquarters in some distant city or some other tour operator somewhere. And that can be a problem. Or it may be that the community is not benefiting as a whole, but 2 or 3 members of it are, but nobody else is. That's still not going to create much of an incentive to protect. And then if the benefits are too selective or not apparent, that doesn't motivate anyone to protect things. Think again of that out-of-state license plate in my parking space. What do I get out of this tourism stuff? Well, I know of one town in Montana that makes it a point to put right on the property tax bill for every citizen there, here's what you saved from tourism in whitefish this year. And if your property tax bill was $1,000, you see it would have been $1,200 if it weren't for tourism. That at least gives some pause. And there are other ways to help locals benefit as well. And then, of course, if locals are motivated to protect places, but there are legal problems or political problems or financial problems and they can't do it, then the virtuous circle doesn't work there either. So there's a lot of tending to these three arrows that needs to be done for good holistic management. And that is why the current best recommendation for this is what we can generically call a Destination Stewardship Council, or some equivalent arrangement. The Global Sustainable Tourism Council is an international nonprofit devoted to just this. And they have criteria for sustainability, both for tourism companies and for destinations. And I work with the destination group at GSTC. And criterion A2 is the critical one. And this is the call for the destination to have an effective mechanism for a coordinated approach, which involves both private and public sectors, and which is suitable to the size of the place, that has funding, and which involves management of the environment and the economy and social impacts and cultural, and get everybody involved with what the place is at the same table and talking about it. And at National Geographic for a few years, we were doing a program called the Geotourism Program, and we define geotourism as geographical character, the type of tourism that supports that. And we had councils set up in many places. This one is in the state of Rhode Island. But the idea was every council would have representatives for each aspect of what makes the place a place and what makes it distinctive from others. And there was an instructive lesson here in Rhode Island too, because we saw this in many other places as well. If the council is brought together by one charismatic person, and then that person goes away, the council will fall apart. We discovered that good leadership requires leaders that groom other leaders to take their place. And the councils that succeeded had just that element. So here's a kind of diagram of what you could call the Dream Destination Stewardship Council. It's part public, government is at the table, and several government departments need to be at the table, not just tourism, but also environment, cultural affairs, if there is such a thing, beautification, if there is such a thing. And then we need the private sector, preferably that part of the private sector that is doing tourism in a way that is supportive of the place and stresses what's unique about it. And then we need the civil society, the NGOs and community-based organizations that work on things like historic preservation and preserving natural areas and so on. And you'll notice that no one of these three sectors is controlling the group. And that's important because we also learned in our work at National Geographic that the council must be structured in a way to survive changes in government. Otherwise, the next time a new government comes in, they throw out the council and the agenda, and you've lost everything that you started with. Practically, the easiest way to do this is to have a core group, and these will usually be self-selecting people, the real people filled with energy and passion and interest in this kind of work. And you can think of that as a sort of steering committee that actually makes things happen. And then a much larger group that can provide the necessary expertise and help for particular programs and projects as the work goes forward. So this is the ideal, or at least one ideal. There's nothing sacred about this, and I'd be interested to hear of anyone that has had experience with other ways to approach holistic management. But there are very few of these in existence. And at the Destination Stewardship Center, we have a project going on looking for examples of Destination Stewardship Council type arrangements that are at least doing a partly good job in holistic management. And I was very pleased yesterday to talk to one of them. And that's in the U.S. state of Wyoming near Yellowstone National Park. Jackson Hole is on the edge of the Grand Teton National Park and includes part of southern Yellowstone. And they are in the process right now of setting up a council that almost perfectly fits the description I just gave you. So I'm delighted to see that, and we want to see how well it works, what lessons they learn, and whether that's a model that can be exported elsewhere. So I want to end with some reassuring notes. We've been concentrating on places that are overcrowded, but the world is still a big place and it's still full of all sorts of uncrowded wonders. And places like these that I've just visited in the past few years and enjoyed seeing all over. Norway, the Azores, and the Mid-Atlantic does a good job of stewardship. The Navan Canal in England, the people who take care of these canals that you can go narrowboating on do a wonderful job, I think. New South Wales and Australia, with places in the hinterland that most international travelers don't even know exist yet. Ljubljana, Slovenia, which has become one of my favorite cities and takes good care of itself. And I would be faulty if I didn't use this chance to put in a plug for our own recent video on Sierra Gorda in Mexico. We're working on a series of videos that look at stewardship success stories from a traveler's point of view. And yeah, you're welcome to take a look at these videos and use them any way you want. And we're going to be looking for more topics as well. So we'd be interested to hear from you. And with that, I think we can go to questions and answer. And I'll stop talking for a little bit. And Kirsty, are you going to take over here?
Yep, absolutely. So thanks so much, Jonathan. Let's start taking questions now. So if you have a question, you just need to raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen there. And from there, click on the raise hand button. Once you've done that, I'll then unmute you and you can ask Jonathan your questions. So that might take, oh, we've got a question. Okay, fantastic. So that's from Tara. I'm just unmuting you now.
Hello, I'm Tara. I'm in New South Wales, Australia. Good to see it mentioned. I'm in Sydney, and we have an attraction in a national park near Sydney. So it's very easy to access for all the visitors to Sydney. And it's had phenomenal growth in a short amount of time, completely pointing the finger at social media. It's become an Instagram hashtag and has become overdeveloped. The national parks attitude seems to be, please don't do any marketing. Please don't tell people how to get there. Please just pretend it's not there anymore. But that doesn't stop people coming. So how, as an immediate response, what do you suggest a destination could do in their short-term changes to marketing about how they talk about a place that's suddenly become attractive?
Dare I ask which park that is, Tara?
Yes, it's Royal National Park on Sydney's southern border, and the attraction is called Figure 8 Pools.
Okay. Yeah, this is an old problem, and I think the Instagram effect is an excellent example of one of those technological changes that's powering over tourism. There's no easy answer for this. I used to think of it as the travel writer's dilemma, because as a former travel journalist myself, I'm still sometimes a travel journalist, you're always wondering, if I write about this place, do I ruin it? Will I now be sending people there? And the answer is, if you don't write about it, somebody else is going to. There's too many people out there, and that was even before Instagram came along. The best advice I can give is that and this would go to the Park Service as well, we have to begin instructing people in how to visit as best we can. We can also stress what's difficult or improper about a place. You know, a lot of these visitors, I'm not familiar with this particular location, but often it's not suitable for them. And I remember
it's the same, yes.
Yeah, and I remember we were doing a map for Grand Teton National Park, in fact, some time ago, and there was a trail, and the Park Service there said, we wish you would not put this trail on the map. It's difficult, it's dangerous, and it's getting too much traffic as it is. And if you're a journalist, that's kind of a dilemma, because you're supposed to report on what's there. And, you know, we're working for National Geographic. We're expected to report the truth. So we did put the trail on the map, but we described it in a way that I hope made it an extreme turnoff for any but the most adventurous of travelers, and made it sound possibly even a little more dangerous than it was. I'm not that happy with that solution, but the park solution.
That's been the current solution as well. Over time, the parks came to it, and they're now describing it as extremely dangerous.
But you know, the answer, well, just don't mention it, isn't going to work because other people are mentioning it. I think eventually you have to end up with on-site policing, and how that's done, I believe, is best if local people are involved in the job of doing that. And I can give you another example from the Colorado Rocky Mountains, and this is one you can probably relate to almost anywhere in the world. There's kind of two groups of recreational people out there in natural areas, the ones that use motors and the ones that don't use motors. And they don't like each other very much. And in the case of the Rockies here, we had the ski mobilers, people on ski-doos that were roaring around through the countryside. And then we had the Nordic skiers, the cross-country skiers that wanted to enjoy the silent wonderfulness of the Rocky Mountains. They didn't get along very well. And what the Forest Service did was to get them both sitting at the table. And after they were done screaming at each other, which I believe took about 3 years, they worked out a plan. And basically it was as simple as ski mobiles there, cross-country skiers here, and we will police this ourselves. And they did, and that approach has worked. In the case of a park like this, the question is, what do the people living next to that area do? Are they interested in helping with this situation? And that might be a question you could take back to the authorities in that area, and to what we call the gateway communities. Any community that's right next to a park or an attraction like that has a relationship with it, whether they like it or not. And it's important that they benefit from taking care of that place. That's a messy answer to your question. I wish I had a cleaner one.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions myself, actually. So we've actually got a lot of tour guides and tour operators in Travel Massive Live. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for those in the group that, of course, want to continue to be successful and grow their business, but of course then also prevent overtourism.
It's tricky, certainly, and of course it depends on the situation, but I think tour guides in particular, I think first of all, tour guiding is one of the most underrated professions on earth. A good tour guide can make all the difference between a great trip and a lousy one. So God bless all you tour guides that do a good job. But I think some of what's going to be required here is more active work with governments that are ultimately controlling a lot of what happens with stewardship of the places that we go. And one thing that's come home to me in recent years is, and I hate to generalize unfairly, but too many government leaders don't know anything about tourism. And too many economic development agency leaders don't know anything about tourism. And part of this is through that divide I showed there before, in that they think of the industry as where the money is, and that's all they have to worry about. Whereas taking care of the place is an enormously important part of it. So I think anyone who's on the front line of tourism, particularly tour operators and guides that are doing their best to introduce people to what's special about a place and give them a good travel experience and also benefit the place. I hope you're taking people around to local businesses and helping spread some of the tourist dollars and euros through the locations, is talk to government. And also talk to the DMOs. For those of you not familiar with that abbreviation, it means Destination Management Organization or Marketing Organization. There's a lot of discussion as to what that M really stands for. but basically it's the Tourist Board or the Convention and Visitors Bureau. And a lot of these people, depending on which country you're in, are focused mainly on marketing and not on taking care of the place that they're marketing. And some of them are required to do nothing but market. But they have an important voice, and they are at least familiar with what the place has to offer. So they need to be part of the equation too. And if it sounds like I'm beginning to describe who should be sitting around that council table, you're right. Tour operators, yes. Government, yes. DMOs, yes. And work together to handle the situation as best you can.
Fantastic. I think that definitely helped answer that question. So I'm also wondering, on a more personal level as well, we all work in the travel industry here. So we're also probably all big travelers ourselves. So I'm wondering what we can do individually to stop over-tourism while still obviously enjoying these destinations.
That's a wonderful question, and I would like to hear other people's thoughts on this. But one thing that we've learned through social science studies about what helps people change the way they do things is other people's examples. And if you begin to get the impression that everybody is recycling in this resort except me, maybe I should do that too. And if everybody's just paying attention to getting a good selfie and not looking at the place and learning about it, well, maybe there's a way to get across the idea, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to learn a little bit about this place where we are, or to try out this new dish, not just eat what we're used to back home. So that's one idea of many. And another, of course, is to use the power of social media. And this is something, in fact, I'd like to explore further with Travel Massive and various other organizations. And that is to begin reporting not just how good was my trip, which is what we're inclined to do when we write a review for TripAdvisor or someplace like that, but instead ask the question a little differently. How do we think this place is taking care of itself? Well, some of that's going to affect how was my trip. But when you ask the question that way and then write about it, destinations pay attention to that. And if a lot of visitors say, I love such and such a town, but boy, there's too much trash in the streets, then it'll begin to be heard. And we've now got new tools with the internet that can kind of scrape opinions from this kind of review. And so think of yourself not just as a tourist, but as a destination reviewer. That makes you a power traveler. How you spend your money and what you say online about the destination means you now are exhibiting your own clout as a caring traveler. I think that's something we can do.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. I think, personally, I will definitely keep that in mind next time I'm abroad. But you hit a little bit before on having, a more authentic traveling experience. I think, that not only are you going to enjoy your travels more, I think you're also going to then, of course, be able to provide that review as well.
Yeah. And even if you're on what we call a fly and flop holiday, where I'm just going to go somewhere and sit on the beach like this picture and enjoy myself, that's fine. But recycle the rum bottles. It's not that hard.
Yep, absolutely. I think we'll probably leave it there. Recycle the rum bottles. All right. So thanks so much for presenting that, Jonathan. I think that was really helpful. And thank you again, Talia, for helping to set all of this up.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us. And want to remind everyone that this is part of the GW's Sustainable Tourism Destination Management Certificate Program. We're really looking forward to kind of exposing people to these principles and getting people to think about over-tourism. It's more than just you being able to take a selfie, somewhere. It's really about how the destination is managed, all the things that Jonathan talked about, and that's a lot of what we focus on in the program. You'll get more about it from Travel Massive in various places.
All right. And my thanks to Travel Massive and to the George Washington University for this opportunity. And if you want to reach me, you can do it through info@destinationcenter.org. Thanks very much, folks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, guys. And thanks so much for joining, everyone. I hope you have a great day or evening, wherever you are. And of course, don't forget to sign up for our next webinars too, if you haven't already. So thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.